apart from the design, the bonding was another question about. Back in the early days when I was looking at all these old derelict heads under my microscope, I would see tips that had been sputtered, with the target sputtering process, RF vacuum sputtering. And that's where you have a glass target inside a vacuum chamber, and you put your work in there, and you have a couple of anodes, and you pull a vacuum on that and put argon gas or some inert gas in there, depending on what material you're sputtering, usually argon, and it's bombarded with a 13 megahertz RF signal. And what the idea is you knock little glass atoms off the target and they stick to the work. In this case it would be the confronting surfaces of the two pole pieces, the gap confronting surfaces. And over a period of hours or time, then you build up a thickness of glass on each of the pieces. And then the next step is you would take that and put it in a clamping jig and then heat it up in a vacuum furnace. And that would bond your two halves together, glass bonding. Now that's a very overly simplified explanation, but that's one process that came into widespread use. The process that we went with was an earlier process, which is called capillary bonding. And that's where you would clamp the two halves in a clamping jig separated by shims, platinum or cleaved mica or something, to the thickness of 50 microinches. So you would have the two pieces clamped there, separated with your shims. So you have a little crack between them. And in the winding window or above or below, you would situate your brazing rods, your glass rods, or if it was glass powder, you'd pack it in, to your window or your channel if you had a channel, which we had both. We had a back channel and a winding window that we packed with glass. And you put that in your oven and heat it up, and through the capillary action, the glass is sucked down in to that void, that crack or that gap between the two pole pieces. And at the same time, depending on, temperature, the temperature's profile, the cycle, how long at what temperature, after you reach a liquid state and it flows, you want that glass to flow back into the ferrite to a small degree. And so that's what we did. We had a fully bond. And You know, when you anneal that in the next step, you know, that's the step where you reheat it and to relieve tensions and stresses on the material and then cool it again. That gives you one of the, or maybe the strongest bond that you can obtain. And that goes back to the early days, like I mentioned before. When I was looking at all these heads under the microscopes, especially tips that had failed, it seemed like every tip that I looked at under the microscope that had chipped in the gap was sputter bonded, you know, with the sputtering technique. I asked Bev about that one day, what he thought or what he could say about any of that, and he said yes, the earlier capillary bonding is a stronger bond, but it's much harder to control and get it right. And of course, our friend Bob Mellers, he bore that out at ICT when he was making our tips. We had about a 40% failure rate, and he thought that was pretty good. You know, 50%'s not unheard of when you're doing that type of a bond, because you can get inclusions between the glass and the ferrite in the channel. And the other way with these vacuum RF sputtering, it was a lot more consistent and you didn't have as high a failure rate, you know, in the bonding cycle. And of course the manufacturers, the people that are building the heads or making the tips, that's very appealing to them because they don't have as many failures, you know, in their manufacturing processes. So they can make more tips and save money. But I wondered about that over the years. Why am I seeing all these tips failing by chipping at the gap when I'm looking under the microscope? And, you know, and predominantly they failed with the tips that had been glass bonded using the sputtering process. So anyway, we had ours made with the old way, the capillary bonding. It's a lot more work and a lot harder and a lot higher failure rate, but in the end, you know, of the ones that come out right, you come out with a much stronger tip. And another thing that is your advantage when you do that is you also have the added advantage of having a glass reinforcement at the bottom of the gap, which would be actually the top if you were, you know, had it mounted on the head. And what that does is as that tip wears down, it gets thinner and thinner. Well, supporting the bottom of the ferrite is this big billet of glass that it's resting on in the winding window. So that's one thing that you don't have in sputtering the gap unless the head refurbisher goes that extra step and actually puts that glass in as reinforcement, but some did and some didn't over the years. And so, you know, in practice, you never get down that low anyway, or you shouldn't. But depending upon, you know, how it's oriented when it's epoxied to the shoe, you could, you know, if somebody didn't do it right. And I've encountered some of that too, you know, under the microscope. And I don't know if that was by design or just they were in a hurry that day. Anyway, I hope this series of videos will be informative and entertaining to you a little bit, and you know, maybe if nothing else, I can you'll at least know a little more than you did the day before about the video heads.
Wow, Larry, that was quite a story, and I didn't fall asleep one time. The information and the journey that you took is very interesting, and the people involved along the way who came to help you. And yeah, I'm kind of like you. I hope this catches the attention of the folks out there listening, because if you do listen closely, it is a very interesting topic. And a very interesting journey. Thank you.
Well, there's more to come.
Okay, well, we look forward to that then. And I guess one last thing is, happy 10th anniversary.
Happy 10th.